Plenty of young people have walked through the doors of this courtroom over the years, carrying the quiet assumption that a powerful surname would absorb whatever was waiting for them on the other side. Most of them recalibrate quickly once they understand where they are. Cassidy Hargrove did not recalibrate. She dropped into the defense chair the way someone drops into a seat at a meeting they did not request and do not intend to remain in long. No nerves, no real presence. When I looked at her directly and asked whether she believed that what she had done to a woman's 17-year restaurant in front of that woman's staff constituted wrongdoing, what came back at me was so completely detached from any recognition that this room held authority over her situation that the next 30 minutes became entirely predictable to me from that point forward. 30 years on this bench have produced one conviction above most others. 19 years old and the daughter of a billionaire is still a defendant in this room, subject to precisely the same jurisdiction as every other person who has ever stood where she was standing. She was about to understand that in a form she would not be able to negotiate around. The file on my desk that morning carried 3 charges: criminal mischief, disorderly conduct, and criminal threatening. The incident was 3 weeks old. A waterfront restaurant called the Meridian, a noise complaint from adjacent tables, and a floor manager who approached a table to request that they lower their volume. What came next was not a disagreement. It was a production. A service cart loaded with glassware was swept to the floor. 2 tables were overturned. When the restaurant's owner, a 54-year-old woman named Ruth Annan, who had been running that kitchen for 17 years, came out from the back to ask the table to leave, the 19-year-old at the center of the disruption moved close enough to Ruth's face to inform her that she would have the restaurant shut down before the end of the month. Cassidy Hargrove was cited at the scene. She did not offer an apology. She told the responding officer that her father's people would take care of it, returned to her car, and left. 3 weeks after that, she walked into my courtroom. She did not arrive late. There was no dramatic entrance. She was simply a 19-year-old in a fitted blazer who moved through the space the way certain people move through rooms they have already decided belonged to them, and she settled into the chair before anyone had indicated she could sit. Her attorney, a senior partner from the firm the Hargrove family has retained for years to manage exactly these kinds of situations, a man who carries the particular exhaustion of someone who has long since stopped believing he can prevent what his client is about to do and has accepted that his role is to minimize the aftermath, leaned toward her and said something quietly before the matter was called. She did not look at him. She was already looking at the bench with the expression of someone calculating the shortest path to the door. In the second row of the gallery, Ruth Annan sat in a dark green blazer with her hands folded and her posture held with considerable effort. 17 years of a restaurant, 23 employees, 3 weeks of managing what came after. She was not performing distress. She had spent the energy that performance requires. She was simply present, holding herself together for exactly as long as the proceedings required, and not one moment longer. Cassidy did not look at the gallery. She looked at the courtroom the way people look at spaces they have already concluded cannot reach them. The matter was called forward. Before the charges had been read in their entirety, Cassidy spoke. She said she intended to address the damages directly and was not entirely certain why the situation had required a court appearance at all, as though the most reasonable resolution would have been for everyone to agree that a misunderstanding had occurred and go home. I informed her that criminal mischief and criminal threatening are not civil matters that a personal check resolves. She said her father's people had indicated this would be handled. I set my pen down. Her attorney moved forward with the prepared statement. The incident had been an overreaction to conduct by restaurant staff that had itself been mishandled from the beginning. The statements directed at Ms. Annan were hyperbolic expressions of frustration rather than genuine threats. The Hargrove family was prepared to make full financial restitution for any documented property damage. He delivered all of this with the particular smoothness of someone reading a document he has produced in slightly different forms many times before. I listened to every word of it. Then I asked my first question. Counsel, your client told Ms. Annan she would have her restaurant shut down before the end of the month. That restaurant has been operating continuously for 17 years. It employs 23 people. What would you like this court to understand about how that statement qualifies as a hyperbolic expression of frustration rather than a threat? The attorney began recalibrating his position. I did not wait for him to arrive at a new one. I turned directly to Cassidy. Ms. Hargrove, I have a question for you. The woman who owns that restaurant is seated in this room. She has been managing the consequences of what you did for 3 weeks. Do you believe that what you did was wrong? Cassidy looked at me briefly. Then she said she thought the entire situation had been blown out of proportion, that the staff had been rude to her first, and that someone had needed to hear that. The gallery went completely still. I looked at Cassidy Hargrove for a moment before I responded. Then I said the following. Ms. Hargrove, let me establish something clearly before this proceeding goes any further. You are not in your father's building. You are not in your family's home or your family's vehicle or any space within your family's world where the name Hargrove changes how things function. You are in this courtroom. And in this courtroom, what your father's people did or did not say about managing this situation has no bearing on what you did, and it has no bearing on what this court is going to do about it. Something moved across her face. Not remorse. I want to be precise about that. What moved across her face was the specific expression of someone who has just encountered, possibly for the first time in her public life, a room that appears to operate by rules she has not previously found a way around. She was reassessing whether the room was serious. She decided to test it. She said she had been completely cooperative throughout the proceeding, and she thought that I needed to understand something. I raised one hand. Ms. Hargrove, stop. She stopped. The courtroom held itself completely still. Her attorney's hands were flat and unmoving on the table in front of him. He was not going to step in. He has spent enough time in close proximity to this family to recognize the moments that cannot be managed. And he understood that this was one of them. I looked at Cassidy. She was looking back at me with the expression of someone who has just stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence for the first time she can recall and cannot quite account for how it happened. I reached for the folder. Ruth Annan had submitted a victim impact statement. I read it into the record. Ruth had not written it primarily as a financial accounting, though the financial accounting was present. The wine glasses, the water, the tablecloth, the cracked chair base, the 4 tables that departed before their food arrived. Those figures were in the record, and they carried weight. But that was not why Ruth had written the statement. She wrote it to put into words what it feels like to watch someone destroy something you built with your own hands in front of your staff and your customers, while telling you directly that they intend to take the rest of it before the month ends. 17 years. A catering operation started from nothing in a leased commercial kitchen, developed across nearly 2 decades into a waterfront restaurant with 23 employees whose daily livelihoods are connected to the decisions she makes every morning. She wrote about the 3 weeks that followed, the sleeplessness, the way the moment she walked out of her kitchen and saw what was happening kept returning to her without being invited. Then she wrote the paragraph I have not set aside. 2 of her servers, both of whom had worked at the Meridian for more than 4 years, came to her separately in the days following the incident and asked quietly whether the restaurant was really going to be shut down. Because they had heard. Because in a workplace of 23 people, information of that kind does not stay contained. She wrote about what it required of her to stand in front of each of those 2 people and answer that question. To be the person responsible for 23 livelihoods, while a 19-year-old's threat was still unresolved in the air above all of it. I read every word of it without inflection, without pause, and without looking up until the statement was complete. Then I set it down and looked at Cassidy. Her jaw was set. Her hands were on the table. But something in her expression had shifted. Not contrition, not yet. The first hairline fracture in the performance of indifference she had been sustaining since she dropped into that chair. I picked up the sentencing file. I found Cassidy Hargrove guilty on all counts. The sentence carried 5 components, and I intended each one to be understood as deliberate rather than procedural. First, a $15,000 fine paid directly to Ruth Annan, covering documented property damages and estimated business loss. Second, 300 hours of community service at 3 specific small businesses in this city that are actively applying for development grants through the city's Economic Development Office. Businesses built by people who started with nothing and are engaged in the daily work of keeping what they built. Real shifts, real work, hours logged and verified by the business owners themselves and submitted directly to this court. Third, a formal written apology to Ruth Annan, reviewed by this court for authenticity before delivery, to be delivered in person at the Meridian in front of the staff. Fourth, mandatory completion of a conflict resolution and anger management program with documented proof of completion submitted to this court. Fifth, a 1-year suspended sentence on the criminal threatening charge to be activated immediately without additional hearing upon any failure to complete any single element of this sentence as ordered. Cassidy's attorney argued that the sentence was disproportionate for a first offense with no prior criminal record. I said the following: your client swept glassware to the floor of a woman's business, overturned tables, and told a 54-year-old woman who had spent 17 years building that business that she intended to destroy it. This sentence is not about what your client did for the first time. It is about what she needs to understand before she does it again. The attorney sat down. Cassidy turned in her chair and looked toward the back row of the gallery. Elliot Hargrove had been seated there since before the hearing began. A tall man occupying a wooden gallery bench in the way people occupy spaces they are unaccustomed to, upright and aware of the surface beneath them. He had come without anyone from his legal team, no associate, no paralegal, no one carrying a document case, just Elliot Hargrove, alone. Cassidy looked at him. He did not stand. He did not speak. He did not gesture or signal or produce any indication that he was going to reach for a phone or deploy any of the resources that had presumably been available to her every other time a room had attempted to hold her to account. He nodded once. The specific nod of a man who reached a decision before he walked through the doors of this courthouse and has no intention of revisiting it inside this room. Cassidy held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to face the bench. I offered Ruth Annan the opportunity to address the court. She stood. She was brief and she was exact. She said she had not pursued these charges in order to punish anyone. She had pursued them because her staff needed to see that what had happened to their workplace mattered to someone outside of it. 23 people had watched a young woman sweep their glasses off a cart and threaten the employment they depended on. Those 23 people needed to know that the law considers that worth showing up for. That was all she had come to say, that someone showed up. She sat down. The courtroom went quiet in the particular way courtrooms go quiet when something has been said that asks for nothing in response. I let the quiet stand. The fine was paid within 2 weeks, directly to Ruth Annan as ordered. The conflict resolution and anger management program was enrolled in and completed within the required period. The 300 community service hours began the following month across 3 small businesses. Real shifts, real work. Hours logged by the business owners and submitted to this court. At the first business, a small independent bookkeeping and tax preparation firm, the hours were completed with the body language of someone fulfilling an obligation and nothing more. Minimal engagement, functional compliance. At the second business, a small catering supply company, something was slightly different, less of the armor. Near the end of her final shift there, Cassidy asked a question about how the inventory system operated. She had not been required to ask it. The third business was David Park's printing and graphic design company. David is 61 years old. He started the business in his garage 22 years ago and has been running it as a sole proprietor without interruption ever since. When Cassidy arrived, he did not know she was anyone's daughter in particular. On her final scheduled shift, with a client order due the following morning that David had not yet finished, Cassidy stayed 2 hours past the time her presence was required. She helped him complete the order. She did not mention it to anyone afterward. The apology at the Meridian was delivered on a Tuesday morning at 8:15 before the restaurant opened for the day. 8 members of staff were present. The written apology had been reviewed by this court before delivery, reviewed specifically to confirm that it reflected a genuine account of what Cassidy had done and what it had cost, rather than a document constructed to perform the minimum possible version of accountability. It passed that review. Not because it was well written. It was not. It was awkward and insufficient in the way that genuine apologies almost always are insufficient. It read like something composed by someone attempting to say a true thing without yet having all the words available to them. Ruth Annan received it. She read it. She thanked Cassidy. Then she walked back to her kitchen because the Meridian opens at 11 in the morning and there was work ahead of her. 6 months after the sentencing hearing at a family dinner, Cassidy told Elliot Hargrove that she had been giving thought to working in small business development. She said she had spent 8 months in rooms with people who had built things from nothing and that she wanted to understand how that process actually worked. Elliot Hargrove said, "Start somewhere and build something." The following week, a letter arrived at this courthouse addressed to me. The return address was a printing and graphic design company on the city's east side. It was from David Park. His letter described a young woman who had appeared at his business for a community service assignment and who had, across the course of her hours there, become someone he found himself noticing, not because she was exceptional in any obvious way or because she performed enthusiasm, because she paid attention. Because on her final scheduled shift, when he was behind on a client order due the following morning, she had remained 2 hours past the time her obligation required and helped him complete it. She had not mentioned it afterward. She had simply stayed, done the work, and left. He wanted me to know. Ruth Annan's impact statement lives in the top drawer of my desk, not the financial accounting section. The paragraph about the 2 servers who came to her separately and asked quietly whether the restaurant was really going to close, and what it required of Ruth to stand in front of each of them and answer that question. There is something this bench cannot answer, whether Cassidy Hargrove will carry forward what she encountered across those 3 small businesses in David Park's print shop at 10 on a Thursday night, finishing a client order for a man who started his company in a garage, or whether she will eventually set it down somewhere and return to the version of herself that walked into my courtroom. No sentence can guarantee which of those futures takes hold. That determination belongs to her and to no one else. But there is something this bench can answer. Ruth Annan's restaurant is open. 23 people are working. A client order was delivered on time because someone stayed 2 hours past the time she was required to stay and did not tell anyone she had done it. Someone showed up. The sentence was the correct sentence. That is precisely what this bench exists to determine and deliver. Cassidy Hargrove walked into this courtroom that morning operating on the assumption that her father's name had already resolved the situation, and her presence was a formality the calendar required. What she had not factored in was a 54-year-old woman in a dark green blazer who had spent 17 years building something from nothing and who came to this courtroom not seeking revenge, but because 23 people needed to see that what had happened to their workplace mattered to someone beyond the walls of it, and a bench that understood that the correct sentence for this specific defendant was not punishment in the abstract, but education in the specific. 3 small businesses, real work, the actual texture of what it means to build something from the ground up rather than sweep someone else's work to the floor in the space of an evening. This was not about making an example of wealth or youth or entitlement. It was about requiring one person to be present in rooms she had not designed, alongside people she had not selected, doing work that needed doing, and to remain past the time she was required to remain, and to leave without telling anyone. Whether that changes the person Cassidy Hargrove becomes is not something this bench can determine. What it can confirm is that someone showed up for Ruth Annan and for the 23 people who depend on what she built. The Meridian is open, 17 years and still here.